in the end, did Inaris really die, or he was just merging down something?
Inaris is dead.
Did you guys ever think about like having a different choice of ending?
玩游戏
Hi guys, I'm Sean. I'm from Game of Graves. Joining me today we have Joe and Paul from Diablo 14.
Hi, I'm Joe Shelley. I'm the game director of Diablo 4.
Hi, I'm Paul. I'm the senior game producer on Diablo 4.
I think the first question I ask about is that in the game, because I finished the game, right? So I saw Andario and Duro as bosses in the game.
Mm-hmm.
But in terms of storylines and what, I don't think they contribute a lot in terms of lore. But the reason I ask is because Andario and Duro is part of the lesser evils, right?
Right.
And they are such a huge character in Diablo universe. In terms of the story of Diablo 4, I don't felt any impact from them. So do you guys have anything to talk about this?
Well, of course, the act in Dry Steps leads to the summoning of Andario, so she is integrated into the game in that context. As you mentioned, they are lesser evils in the world of Diablo, and the story here focuses on the creators of Sanctuary, Lilith and Inarius. But we were very happy that we were able to include Duriel and Andario, who are sort of key figures in the history of Diablo. Players who've played previous games will recognize them in a way that makes sense in the context of the story.
Mm-hmm. At the same time, I think especially Duriel shows a good example of Elias's motivation and how far Elias wants to go in bringing the mother back, for example. So while it was a smaller beats of story per se, like Joe said, I definitely had the importance of being part of the story of Diablo.
I think like Lilith and Inaris is such a big character in the game this time around. In the end, did Inaris really die, or he was just merging down something?
Inaris is dead.
100% is dead.
If you think about the lore of Diablo, there's the way that angels are born, that's still the case, but his wings are ripped off.
I think like for the story, like a lot of times where Mephisto keep telling you, hey, actually Inaris is not as good as you think he is. So I thought at a certain point we would be able to battle Inaris. Did that ever came to the game itself?
I think that Inarius is an interesting character because he is not aligned with the player, right? And you see that when he takes the Soul Stone, for example. So he's certainly not on the player's side. But their goals sometimes align and sometimes don't align. And I think that is part of what makes him such an interesting character. In the end, it's not just, he was evil, and here's a boss battle.
And I think you can still battle these ideologies through fighting Penitent Knights, and then especially in my favorite Theater of Light Castle Dungeon, you get to really immerse yourself into perhaps something that Inarius has built all these years. I think you can still have the taste of what fighting Inarius meant.
I mean, after we talk about Inarius, we talk about Lilith, which is the biggest character in the game right now. Is she really helping us, or is she not really?
We've talked a lot about how the story of Diablo 4 is really just beginning with the launch of the game. And I think that there's a lot to think about with the arc of the story, how it wraps up with Lilith and Mephisto, and where it can go from there. To some extent, like Inarius, Lilith's goals align with those of the humans and the player, and to some extent they don't. And ultimately, you defeat Lilith at the end of the game, but she's not simply an evil character. You get to understand her motivations, and to some extent you can empathize with some of her reasoning.
Yes. I mean, if there is a choice in the game where if you ever ask me to do it, I would like, let's join up. Did you guys ever think about like having a different choice of ending?
When we think about planning for the future of Diablo, we want to be able to tell a story that has a sort of a long arc, and so it's important to have events in the story that are contiguous, and so we set it up so that the story can move forward as we're planning.
In terms of lore-wise, are there any story progression?
Yes. So the seasons will let you interact with other little stories within Sanctuary, other characters, but when we think about expansions, that's where you could expect to see more story.
Yeah, I mean, because the ending didn't really have a conclusion, and Nero ran off with Mephisto. So that was a bit unexpected.
Well, I mean, have the endings to Diablo games ever had that kind of conclusion?
Not really, but I think maybe we could talk about the design of Lilith in the previous games was not as prominent, but this time it's always the author of hatred because Lilith actually have like 2 phases of boss fight. Do you guys want to talk about like how the design came out for Lilith?
Yeah, well, Mephisto is also a key character in the story of Diablo 4 and from the first moments that you're playing the game throughout. And Lilith is Mephisto's daughter, and so when we designed that second form of her boss fight, we wanted to make sure that you could identify some of the sort of shape language and some of the resemblance to Mephisto, especially if you refer to how Mephisto has appeared in previous games. We wanted players to make that connection visually as well as through the story. Of course, that fight takes place in the area where Mephisto is reforming, so it sort of ties it all together.
So I think this is probably the first Diablo game that Diablo is not actually involved. You guys have anything to say about that?
I think that the story of Diablo has centered on Diablo, but Diablo is one of the 3 primates, right? When we set out to build Diablo 4, we wanted to tell a story about the people of Sanctuary. And so from there, we went out to the creators of Sanctuary, and we wanted to tell a story that included them as characters that were nuanced and developed. And of course, that story from the lore is a story that relates to Mephisto. And so Mephisto figures prominently in the story of Diablo 4. And we didn't want to undermine that sort of cohesion, that the story making sense by sort of forcing Diablo in because his name is on the box. We wanted to be true to the story that we were telling.
One interesting Easter egg that you mentioned that you went there, you do get to visit the altars of the people. So I thought that was a pretty nice touch, and yeah, we'll go from there.
So when I play the game, right, I noticed there are a lot of shrines around where you go around and use your emotes to do stuff.
Oh,
does it like have any relevance in the lore? Or
I think we should keep an eye on those shrines as we sort of go forward. We have a lot of stuff to add in seasons. One of the things that's cool about building such a big world like this is that there's a lot of opportunity for our developers to sort of add things to the world that can figure into the game later or not, depending on sort of how the game develops.
Is there a reason why Tyrael was not in the game? I mean, he was mentioned a couple of times. Like, where is he right now? Is there something that you can tell us?
Well, the story of the campaign of Diablo 4 is focused on people, on humans, and we've wanted to make sure that it stayed focused on that and that we didn't have an aspect of a powerful entity that comes in and saves the day. We wanted it to be up to the player and up to people like Donan, who are mortal, right? And people like Lorath and people like Nerel to show that humans can face off against these sort of mythical figures.
Where are the Nephilims right now? It's such a big deal with Diablo 3, right? And Diablo 4, they're just not there.
Well, so I talked before about how the story of Diablo 4 is a story about humans contending with forces that are supernatural or incredibly powerful beyond what humans can do. And we felt like in order to tell that story effectively, the player needed to be one of those characters too. We talk a lot about how the player appears in game cutscenes, and that helps the player actually be part of the action. We can tell a story that includes the player in a way that we couldn't before. When you think about how powerful the Nephilim is at the end of Diablo 3, we felt like that would undermine the story that we wanted to tell about human struggles.
I suppose I want to talk more about the ending stuff, right?
Sure, yeah.
So I felt it's amazing. So the codex of power, right? So when you extract the power, then you can imprint on something else. So I imprint on something, then I couldn't extract it anymore.
Oh, yes.
It's on purpose, right?
Yeah, being able to extract a legendary power is incredibly versatile and incredibly powerful. Of course, you can move it to a different slot as well. So you can have, if you have 2 pairs of boots that have both the powers you want, previously you would have to choose which one you wanted, but now you can take the power off one of the boots and move it to something else and have them both at once, right? So it's incredibly powerful, but we do want to have some constraints on it, and that's where the Codex of Power comes in too, right? Because for many of the legendary powers, many of them are exclusive to legendaries, but there are quite a few, 100 or so, Codex of Power entries. So you can go complete a dungeon, unlock that Codex of Power, and then you can always have that aspect available to imprint on gear, but it allows you to, let's say that you have a build where, maybe having a barrier is really key to your build. As you're upgrading your gear, you're swapping out slots, and with the Codex of Power, you can make sure that that barrier comes with you so that your build doesn't sort of fall apart as you're equipping new items.
And I think that's really cool because now not only unique and legend gear is important, because you can always find better gear to imprint whatever you want to imprint, for example, the barrier. So there's just a lot more different ways for you to really imagine how you want to go about your build, which I think is also really interesting.
I also realized that refunding skills, especially if you refund all of them, really expensive at the end game.
So we've been tuning the respec costs throughout development. And again, as a live service, it's something that we'll continue to monitor. What we want is for the cost to respec to be something that making some choices about what kind of character you want to be, so that it doesn't feel like you're just everything and you have to sort of go through some inventory or some UI management to like, I'm an everything sorcerer, right? Like we want to have some definition of your build, and the cost helps with that. But we don't want the cost to be so prohibitive that you feel like you're locked into one. And so we've been tuning that cost, and we'll continue to tune it as it goes forward.
Do you have anything you want to tell us?
Well, one of the things that a key part of our Diablo 4 development, our philosophy, is to make sure that when people pick up Diablo 4, that there are things in there for people who've played the previous game, right? Like you see Lorath in Diablo 3 and Reaper of Souls. If you've played that and you meet him in that cabin, that's meaningful to you. And then you get to go on this whole adventure with him, right? But at the same time, if you've never played a Diablo game before, when you jump into Diablo 4, the story tells you everything you need to know about these characters. Lorath is developed in Diablo 4, even if you haven't played Diablo 3. If you play Diablo 3, then you get sort of this extra fun and sort of recognition of some of these characters. But a new player who's never played any Diablo can jump into Diablo 4, have a great time, get engaged by the story, and get engaged by the lore. And maybe you go play another Diablo game after that, and that's great. But you don't have to. You can jump right in.
One really cool mechanic that I think we have as lore and as a narrative, you understanding Lilith, it's not just us giving you a wall of text and then making you read it. It's actually having that connection through that event in the chapel, and then you actually really diving deep into what Lilith is facing, what she wants to do with her sons and daughters. So I think that kind of mechanic of hand-holding in a natural way was also a good mechanism for even like newer players to really understand what's happening in D4. And on top of that, if you knew Diablo, there were a lot of elements that you could kind of back up on. And going back to Joe's comment, that it wasn't like necessary for you to understand previous story.
I think that's thanks for the interview. Thanks for the time. Thanks for having me.
Yeah.
Thank you. We're glad to talk to you.
Appreciate it.
Yeah.